2. You know, God is barely mentioned in these first couple of chapters. God's barely mentioned. But this is the creator God of Genesis. I mean, in reality, when this was originally put together, these were not separate books. This was one huge narrative, these first 5 books. The problem is the scrolls get too long. So you have to stop it somewhere. And so this was the stopping point, because there's kind of a time jump in here. So this is kind of a natural break point. But in reality, this is one story from Genesis through Exodus into Leviticus and on down. So this is the creator God who's about creating life and preserving life and blessing life. There would be no Exodus as we understand it without understanding the God of creation. I mean, the Exodus comes out of this same God's covenant, this God's story with Abraham and Isaac and Joseph, and that's how this whole story plays out. And the saving of Moses has this cosmic significance to it. It's tied to the stories of creation in Genesis. Now, that sounds like a bit of a reach, that the Moses story is tied to creation. Well, the Hebrew word for basket that Moses' mother places him in is the exact same Hebrew word that gets used for Noah's Ark. And we think of the ark as this massive, massive piece of building in a basket, but they use the same word for them. Moses' mother, what it says in there is that, she saw that, as he's falling, she saw that he was good. If you can't hear, and God saw that it was good, Israel and creation, are both about to be drowned in the water. And, same with Moses. This is what's going to happen. All the little boys of Israel are about to be drowned in the Nile, just as all the people were drowned in the flood. And Noah and Moses are both set adrift on the water. And both of them are the chosen ones in and through whom creation's going to keep going. It's going to be preserved. The Bible doesn't play the same note for no reason. If you're hearing it and going, that sounds really familiar, there's a reason. There's a reason. Especially in the Old Testament. Especially in these early books, because so much of life was heard, not read. People heard these stories. They're going to hear the same words, the same lines, the same phrases, and it's going to take them back to, oh, yeah, that sounds just like the last story we had. That sounds just like what I remember. If Pharaoh was to succeed, then that means that God's plan for creation would be in danger. This is a God who, yes, works on a cosmic level, but at the same time works through people. God is working through people. And it's the ones, especially in this case, that society doesn't see as a threat. A bunch of women. What threat is that? In fact, let all the women live. Because what are they going to do? It's just a bunch of women. They can't do anything to hurt us. When the army shows up, it'll be fine. But what Pharaoh forgot is that those are also the ones God can work through. God can work through all of us. They're the ones who are creating and bringing the life that God wants us to have and to share. So this is, we're tying all these pieces together. Creation and Noah and the patriarchs and this rebirth that's going to happen for the people with Moses. And all of this comes up again when we get into Matthew. We're going to see all of this again because Moses' story is the model that Matthew uses for who Jesus is. There's 5 books at the beginning, the 5 books of Moses. Well, there's 5 major sets of teaching that Jesus does in Matthew. There's so many places where Moses comes up and references to Moses. There's a continuity in the way that God is working in both Moses and Jesus. And this Old Testament story is going to be really important when we get there. I think it's hard to get the full measure of what is being said if we don't understand what it's tied to. The way that God is at work to bring fullness of life, not just in the time of Jesus, but way before that. So we have to remember that any definition we have of God being sovereign, God being king, has to account for a God who's working through ordinary people. And when God works through ordinary people to carry out that divine purpose, there's always a risk in that. Because in this case, these women are very highly effective. They do a really excellent job of thwarting all the plans that the Pharaoh has. But working through people makes God vulnerable, in a sense, because God has to sometimes modify the plans. We're going to see that next, in a couple weeks here when we get into Moses, that sometimes God has to give up control of some of the events and has to work through what's possible. And so here you see God repeatedly having to take risks by working through people. Because we aren't always going to do things the way God wants us to do them. We're not always going to do things the way that God tells us to do them. Sometimes we go and get ideas of our own and go off on our own tangents and do our own things, and God's like, yoo-hoo, over here, we were going to work on this now? Yeah. And a major concern in Exodus that's going to keep cropping up is, who are we going to recognize as sovereign? Yahweh or Pharaoh? Who is Israel going to serve? Whose sovereignty are we going to follow? And at first it looks like the Israelite people are going to be right on board with Yahweh. But then it keeps cropping up. They keep pining for what they had, or they keep wanting to go back, and they keep wanting grass was greener over there. So it's a constant struggle that God's going to be engaged in, trying to get everybody to move the same direction. So this Exodus is this really powerful symbol. It's this really powerful symbol that the present situation we're in doesn't define what is possible for God. With God, change and newness are always possibilities. This was the situation put in front of these midwives, and they're like, no, that's not what's going to happen. The situation that gets put in front of Moses' mother and sister, no, they're not going to let that happen. The situation that gets put in front of Pharaoh's daughter, she doesn't let that happen. So there's always room for what is possible. Always room for what is possible. And so this is a story, the Exodus has been told and retold, because it's the story of liberation and of hope, and this story of walking with God, which is one that we need to hear again and again. But what's really important to remember is that the book of Exodus insists that we can't talk about this liberation that we're free of all restraint. It is not a declaration of independence. Not at all. This is moving from bondage under Pharaoh to the service of Yahweh. One cannot pass by Sinai on the way to the promised land. One can't pass by the commandments. One can't pass by the law. The question asked, whom will we now serve? And Exodus is here to remind us that our true freedom is found in service to Yahweh, in service to God. It's not about there's no longer any rules, there's no longer anything. It's about the difference between oppression and hope, the difference between violence and love, the difference between being pushed down and forced down and kept in one place versus the freedom to move and act and do as God leads. And so when our system, our group, our family faces a change, how do we react? Is there always someone in your family who runs around with their hair on fire? Do you have that one relative? Doesn't matter what it is. Oh my gosh, it's the most horrible thing. And they run around and get everybody in a panic, and you're all just like, whew. Do you have that one person who's the voice of reason, who can just say, okay, everybody just take a breath and calm down. It's going to be fine. Let's find out what's happening next. You know, how does your system operate? Because every family, every group, every church, every community, it's a system. And people kind of have different roles in that system. And what do you do when a certain person's no longer there to take on their job? That's how this whole story started. Because the old